now the plan is to have our two panelists, starting with Daron Acemoglu and then Rohini Pande. And the plan is to have then for them to speak for 15 minutes each, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A and general discussion. In the interest of time, I'll just move us into it. Daron, please go ahead.
Hey, Ernesto, thank you.
I won't interrupt you, but once you hit the 15-minute mark, I'll chime in just to let you know.
Okay, I'll try to do actually shorter than that so that we gain some of the time. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this, Monica and Leonard. So I have 4 comments. First of all, this is a very important initiative. More on the empirics of politics is sorely needed. We know there are huge productivity differences across firms in narrow sectors, across regions in a country, across countries. And in all of these cases, the exact mechanisms, pathways for these are poorly understood, but in most of them, political factors appear to play an important role. In the case of countries and regions, there's already some circumstantial evidence as well as some econometric evidence supporting it, but I think the same is true across firms as well. And I think the ambition here is broad enough to include all of those. My second comment is a bit of a petty one, but let me make it, which is that I think as political economy becomes more and more of a central part of social science and economics, perhaps the language of political distortions, which is itself a consequence of the methodology of the one particular reading of economics, is actually now outdated and should be abandoned. So in economics, the usual way in which we always start is let the benchmark be a model in which everything is perfect, the first best is implemented, completely without any problems, and as a result, the only thing that any realistic feature in the world can do is to create distortions. And somehow we start from that world, and all politics is in the form of distortions. And I think this is the wrong way to think about the world. Politics is everywhere, and politics and institutional features will be necessary for achieving any type of efficiency. And successful cases are not those where politics plays less of a role, but they are the ones where politics creates different incentives and works differently. And I think having such a holistic approach might be a better one for this ambitious undertaking, which means let's abandon the word political distortions, perhaps, as the guiding principle. The third comment is that I want to sort of, and this is already in there in what Monica and Leonard presented, but let me show it more clearly. In some sense, there are 3 different sets of effects of politics, and I think one should distinguish them. A lot of although this can be read between the lines in the presentation, I think a lot of the work that was highlighted is really about the first one, which are the direct effects. So I try to estimate what's the effect of politics by looking at connections among firms, or blockage of certain technologies, or specific political distortions. These direct effects are important, by my view, is that they are not even the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the effects of politics works through general equilibrium effects, and then secondly, even broader social effects. So what do I mean? What do I mean by that? By general equilibrium effects, for instance, imagine not that what's the effect of connections on firms, but what is the effect of the set of political incentives and the institutional environment de jure and de facto on which firms are actually active. which sectors active, which sectors get the capital. So it might well be that in many African countries, manufacturing is low productivity precisely because connections in agriculture or services don't let manufacturing firms achieve minimum efficient scale. So if you do a direct effects, you're not going to say that's related to politics, but it's really very centrally related to politics. How on earth would you explain the fact that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is so behind manufacturing and productivity in many manufacturing industries is so low? Education, the fact that, the classic economic accounting would say, well, that's the effects of human capital. Well, that's not unrelated to the political environment that deprives many communities of the educational resources or creates specific distortions. But the social effects are even more important potentially. We're all embedded in a social equilibrium with soft and hard incentives created by politics. So if you take, for example, one paper that is well known and you mentioned is Melissa Dell's paper on the long-term effects of the META. So if you look at her estimates, she's comparing villages that were part or not part of the coercive labor practices created by the mining META, more than 150 years ago. So any reasonable explanation for these has to really recognize that there are certain social changes in what are people's aspirations, what people think is possible, how they approach authority, how they approach the market, that were themselves effects of, decades of vicious coercion. The same is true when you look at other coercive practices in Africa, Latin America, the US South, and so on. And you're not going to capture those just by focusing on economic general equilibrium effects either, but they are no less important in thinking about politics. Finally, solutions. So I think one thing that's admirable about this project is that it's very forward-looking. How can we identify political factors and then deal with them? And I think it's, again, useful to sort of summarize how the economics profession has approached these issues. I think there are four broad ways in which the economics profession has approached them. I think the first one is ignore politics. This is the view that there are so many efficiencies, there are lots of $50 bills lying around in developing countries, and the problem of development is just to pick up these $50 bills. Because they are $50 bills, they're not $1 million bills. The politics doesn't matter because they're small amounts, so they can actually solve these problems. Well, I think this view is both empirically incorrect and logically incoherent. It's logically, empirically incorrect. I think a lot of the works that you guys will do will show that much better than I can summarize now, but it's also logically incoherent. If really you're going to create development out of collecting lots of $50 bills, that's not any different than collecting $1 million bill, because it's going to will have to amount to $1 million bill. To say that politics doesn't matter because we're doing small amounts, I think is not logically coherent. So the second would be avoid politics. Again, that might be feasible when you're doing a few things, not really thinking about the whole process of economic development and political development. I think one great example of that is the Partner in Health, founded by Paul Farmer, for example, that have done wonderful things in many developing countries, Haiti, Rwanda, Malawi. And if you look at what their system is that we bring the best healthcare and we avoid politics. The way that they do that is they go far away from the capital city. They go to places where the hospitals are going to get least interactions with politicians or bureaucrats. But you can do that with one hospital. You cannot do it beyond. So I think avoid politics is not easy either. So I think the next two is what we should really focus on, is understand politics at the micro level. So deal with politics at the micro level. I think that's the most feasible one. If politics is not just these distortions rained from above, but really it's the fabric of life in all economies, then we have to grapple with politics at the micro level for dealing with firms, dealing with regions, dealing with public goods, dealing with law enforcement. But also there's the macro politics issues, which Monica was talking about at the end, civil society, democracy, etc. I think those are very important to understand, recognize, talk about. Of course, no single researcher, not even the World Bank, has ever been successful in having an impact on macro politics. And I don't think it's that advisable either for outside researchers to go as messiahs and say, we're going to change your macro politics. But I think the do no harm principle is important. We have to understand what the macro politics is, how it functions, how it can veer even in worse directions. And it's both useful for us to inform on that, but also understand the implications of our actions. For example, when Americans started funding NGOs in Egypt after the Arab Spring, and then Sisi's government came in, they did not pay attention to what was going on, and they kept on funding the NGOs. And then the Sisi's government said these are all foreign agents, because some of those NGOs wanted to engage in more civil society action. In fact, that's what the US government had said. So all of them ended up in jail. So, so you have to sort of understand the macro politics, where it's going, and make sure that we actually don't do any harm. And in fact, I would say a lot of the foreign aid that was paid and given to developing countries over the last 60 years has really failed to heed this issue of understand do no harm. When you give money to the hands of Mobutu or Mugabe or Museveni, I think the no harm principle is definitely being violated. So I think that doesn't mean that you should refrain from foreign aid. Absolutely not. That has a useful role, but at least those has to be part of the costs and benefits. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I actually have a couple of slides. So let me share my screen. So can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations. Sorry, let me make sure I'm actually at the right place. Yeah. And congratulations. I think this was both a great presentation. The framework I read for the Inception paper looked really interesting. I look forward to it and hopefully assigning it in our graduate political economy class as well. So let me just start by briefly summarizing how I think I see you setting up the structure. So the main framework within which you're thinking about growth effects is really this idea of Schumpeterian innovation-led growth, that we want to understand how an economy can be on the frontier of creative destruction. And in this model, the types of political economy factors that you're concerned about link very much to thinking about market structure. So how do we get the right market structure and the right kind of institutions? And the review, which I think Leonard and Monica did a great job of putting forward, really focuses on largely, I would say, what's the frontier of empirical political economy is focused within countries, have a well-defined theoretical idea that comes from the literature, but then pay a lot of attention to try to identify kind of the causal effects of what we see as those political economy factors, and ask how market structure and institutions can create productivity wedges. And so in this sort of framework, if you ask what kind of policy should we be moving the governments towards, I think the types you kind of you would get is that you should kind of regulate firm activity and market structure in order to create a level playing field for entrepreneurs. We want to reduce rent seeking, reduce elite capture. So I think what I'm going to do is often easy for discussants to do. So that's why I think I'll try to set a slightly higher standard, is to say, I think this is fantastic. But if you really want to think about the political economy of structural transformation, I would encourage you to kind of expand the ambit of what you're looking at. And as I said, that's all. I think it's always easy for discussants to say, do 5 more things. So let me start with some motivation for why I actually think to actually talk about structural transformation sensibly, we want to do that. So let me start with a graph from a recent paper by Maggie McMillan, Danny Roderick, and the co-author, which is part of the series of work thinking about premature deindustrialization, or how structural transformation is taking place in the developing world. So here what they do is they try to decompose productivity growth between 1990 to 2005 And the main finding they have is they distinguish between two things. One is within sector productivity gains, and the other is structural change in terms of how labor moves. And what they find is that when we look across the developing world, you typically see structural change, within sector productivity gains have been positive. So you have seen, you've had moves up quality ladders, you've had productivity gains in terms of production mechanisms. But what's striking is that if you define structural change by whether labor has moved from lower skilled to higher skilled activity, that has happened a lot less. So in fact, they argue that in Latin America and Africa, if anything, you see on net, workers are not moving into more productive sectors. Asia looks good, but it looks good largely for China. If you look, for instance, in India, India is much more mixed. It went from agriculture to service-led growth, and not a lot of upskilling of workers happen. And I think more generally, the fact that we know is true is that GDP moves sectors much faster than labor moves sectors. So I think if you're going to think of a structural change and think of it by bringing in a perspective also on labor, and I'll talk in a second why I think that's important, I think you want to think about what's happening to labor, not just what's happening to firms. The second reason I think I'd encourage you to expand it is structural transformation, even if it's done right in terms of the best entrepreneurs get it, it doesn't mean that everyone gets lifted up. We very well know by now that growth is not the tide that lifts all boats. So just to give you two examples, so the U-shaped graph is from Marion Bertrand's LA lecture this year. And I think it's a very nice graph because what it does is it depicts the U-shaped curve in female labor force participation that I think is sort of well understood in the literature by now. But what she makes the point is that if you divide countries by the level of sexism, and where you define sexism very specifically as when jobs are scarce, men have more rights to jobs than women do, what you find is that the U-shape is really driven by levels where these underlying cultural norms, or Daron was talking about long-term institutional persistence, is much more stark. And certainly India, which I think is really at the bottom of this, is a country where we know that the period of high economic growth has actually been accompanied by reductions in labor force participation among women. So again, if you take a structural transformation perspective and say one of the things we want to do is have improved talent allocation, it's not going to be enough, again, to focus on entrepreneurship. We want to think about informal institutions. We want to think about labor allocation. And then on the right, I just wanted to highlight the fact that I think you have a 5-year looking ahead program in structural transformation. It's going to be very hard to do that without thinking about what climate change is going to do for things like productivity. So this graph just shows you that if you think about where temperature variability is going to rise the most, it's in poor countries. And at least I think the one thing we know from the climate change literature is that higher temperatures tend to reduce labor productivity. So that's in terms of just arguing that if you want structural transformation and you want to think about movements of populations, you have to think, I think you need to think about the labor side. I think my second argument builds a bit on Daron's argument of saying that, we should think of politics as more than distortions. And I think I want to push it further. I want to push it further to say that perhaps we need to think of a normative perspective that's not about saying that growth is what we want to aim for. And the way I think about it is, countries may be weakly democratized, but the majority of the world's poor now live in democratic countries. And what I think about really the kind of the catch-22 of democracy is, the poor don't have power in a lot of these democracies. How do you actually get them the power? Well, one place we can start from when we start thinking of structural transformation is to really ask, what do the poor want? So this is data from the Global Barometer survey across a bunch of countries. It's divided for the entire population in the country and also the vulnerable population, which is rural, less educated. And the question that was asked in the barometer is, what do you think is the most essential characteristic in a democracy? And they were given 4 choices. So unsurprisingly, free and fair elections come at the top, but not by a lot. The second one is progressive redistribution. I think there's a strong sense that citizens think that a role of the government is to reduce the gaps. Interestingly, the idea that government does not waste any money, I think one of the things we think about in kind of corruption and distortion is actually the lowest of them. So I think there's also a case that when we think about normatively what do you want to achieve from politics and structural transformation, I'm not sure we can kind of push by saying it is going to be the most growth. It has to be something that in the end is justifiable to what the citizens want. And that, I think, has to include some notion of inclusive growth. And so I think in the inception paper, the push, which is a very sensible one, is to talk about how do we support productive entrepreneurship. But when you look at what citizens say they want certainly to be better off, but they also, I think among the more vulnerable, look for an inclusive democracy. So having sort of hopefully motivated some reasons for focusing on a broader perspective, let me talk a bit about how I think you can expand your frameworks to get at this. So I'm going to start with, 1954, I think for economic development was a very interesting year. It was the year a lot of things happened. So it was the year Schumpeter's magisterial history of economic analysis came out posthumously. It was the year, actually, the first couple of papers on poverty traps by Liebenstein and others came out. But importantly, it was also the year of Arthur Lewis's paper. So, Arthur Lewis put forward this paper, his paper on thinking about development in a dual economy. He made a very strong argument for why we should think of sectors and why we might think about unbalanced or uneven growth happening, where you have a modern sector which could be functioning completely like the Schumpeterian sector. But then there is this traditional sector which may be very unlinked with it. It has a perfectly elastic labor supply. And whether and how these two sectors get linked is really going to define the extent to which you're going to have either balanced growth or you're going to prevent things like conflict. And then a bit later, I think Esther Bostrup wrote a really important book on women in economic development, where she very clearly talked about how there was no reason to believe that structural transformation was inconsistent with systematic marginalization of some groups. She talked about it in the context of agriculture, which is where she worked, but I think what she wrote seems to me very topical. So I think I would say that one way to expand your framework is to recognize is that you're thinking a lot about how politics is entering in terms of entrepreneurship. There's another channel through which is potentially entering is by the extent to which it's enabling or not enabling labor reallocation and potentially trickle down. And the channels that if we think about in the Lewis model, I think some of the channels that we typically think about, first, obviously, just occupational choice. So is it actually, what is it doing in terms of moving occupational choice? The second and third, which I'm going to put in together, the second is the kind of classic demand channel. So I think even in the beginning of your talk, when you're talking about the Murphy-Schleifer-Vishny model, I think that's, again, very consistent with this model that these sectors get linked up in some ways through demand. But I think more broadly, I think of that as redistribution. To what extent, either through markets or through governments, are we linking these through sectors in terms of outcomes? And so I think sort of just to summarize and then close, I'd say I have two suggestions. So first, I think with the paper's interest in thinking about political economy, and I think largely now, it's sort of a given for most of us who work in political economy that we tend to take the perspective of what is feasible in democracies. I would expand the normative focus to start a little bit also from what do we think the poor want from structural change. And also I think recognize that, climate change or people's reactions to climate change may affect the type of growth as possible. I think political economy has seen a lot of very interesting work on mass movements, for instance, recently. My prediction is one area where I think we're going to see mass movements increase a lot is youth mass movements on issues like climate change. And thinking about what that does to politics or how that affects outcomes, I think will be relevant to thinking about, what kind of growth policies can you get support for. The second thing I'd say is when it comes to the positive focus of the types of kind of empirical papers that you're looking at, I would be a little bit, I would kind of give Lewis some stage as well, not just Schumpeter. And I think first, I do think it's important to think a little bit about politics in agriculture. If it is about structural transformation, economic growth, what's happening in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is possibly going to be the precursor for people moving into industry or, how the labor sector in that sector kind of reacts with it. There's a whole set of work from Robert Bates and thinking about market distortions, which I think would be very parallel to what you're thinking about in the industrial sector. But I think there's a very large literature and certainly one where I think there's a lot of scope for new work. The second thing I think is, I would think about political economy a little bit also from a labor perspective. And equally, and I think this again goes back to what Daron was talking about in terms of institutional persistence, sort of think a bit about how not just regulations, but how are informal institutions and norms affecting talent allocation. So let me end with just 3 examples of the kind of questions that I think this would lead yourself to. So, so first, I think there are questions, there's research going on thinking about, how do we use policy to affect both formal and informal power structures? How does this affect aspirations and talent allocation? How does this actually affect the nature of entrepreneurship? I think the kind of going through the whole arc hasn't happened as much as it should. I think labor unions are incredibly understudied by political economy in developing world. They're important. We sometimes talk a bit about teacher unions, but really understanding the ways in which they're actually affecting the industrial structure would be very valuable. Another is the role that especially left-leaning parties are playing in representing labor interests. To what extent are they working through unions? To what extent are they otherwise affecting the industrial structure in these economies? And then finally, I think a little bit about how will the politics of structural change play out in an era where we're going to see increasingly climate change. I mean, this may be slightly longer term and maybe requires a different type of analysis, but it feels like kind of the kind of careful empirical work that you have identified so well. I think we know less about that when we think about the politics of climate change. So thank you very much. Let me stop here.
Great, thank you, Rohini, and thank you, Daron. 2 perspectives, both broad and deep. What I will do is monitor the chat for those who don't have an open microphone. Others who have access to the microphone can chime in and discuss and ask questions. My experience with online meetings has been so far that sometimes it takes people a little bit to warm up and shoot. So let me take a minute to make a couple comments or ask questions myself while people hopefully are mulling over what they're going to contribute. I was very stimulated by the presentations of Monica and Leonard, and also the panelists. There's a couple of things that I would like to put on the table. One is that there is a concern we have about capture, state capture, influence from firms and private interests, because they will seize the state, they will hijack the state for their own purposes. There is also a concern that wasn't so much in the focus today, but maybe we should pay attention to it. I know there is a type of economists who work in regulation that do care about it. That has to do with the possibility of political risk, regulatory risk, and expropriation risk. That is an important interaction between the private sector and government. And sometimes people view firms engaging in many of these things that we've been talking about, using connections and so on, not in an offensive way, but in a more defensive way. And so that's something that certainly they would count as important political distortions. Now, going to the terminology of political distortions, I agree with Daron, and I wonder whether it might make sense to think of what the right benchmark would be. So does it even make sense to strive for a kind of welfare theorem-like benchmark that does include politics, right? So, and maybe what that would look like is the markets are competitive and everybody has perfect information, and politics kind of looks like that. We have representative democracy, voters elect politicians that, and we have perfect accountability. Voters observe everything politicians do. There's no agency problems. And so maybe we can think of a benchmark where both markets and politics are perfect, and where we talk about market failures and political failures, as departures from that benchmark. Maybe that's one way to think about that. Now, of course, there's no place on earth that's going to look like that. But maybe that gives us a way of thinking about how politics is deviating from that. Yeah, the other thing that maybe it's also worth thinking about in terms of the structure is I liked your way, Monica, how you described, I think it was you, the things like crony capitalism or elite dominance as deeply ingrained structures that are more persistent. Now, I wonder whether what distinguishes these is persistence, or rather that you are really going one level deeper in the chain of causation, if you will. So at the end of the day, crony capitalism or elite domination is about ultimately capturing the state. It is also about regulatory capture. It's about all of those things. But I think you're speaking about a more systemic condition that leads to those things. So I think it may be helpful to think about the chain of causation and how you can cut it into chunks for the purpose of reviewing work in each one of those stages. And with that, I think it's time for me to make room for others to chime in and engage with all these interesting ideas.
So may I just just take 1 minute to thank a lot Rohini, Daron, and Ernesto for these super thoughtful comments. We will definitely take them into account. I just feel that in some of your comments, we're trying to do set up the research agenda for the next few years. You're pushing us to do the research agenda for the following 20. I think that some of the areas you point out are fascinating but really underdeveloped, and we really need as a community to think more carefully, especially on these social norms, climate change, bringing in labor unions and so on. I think that's super relevant, and we'll do our best in bringing all this into the Inception paper.
So maybe while the colleagues are warming up, let me also join Monica to thank Rohini and Daron and Ernesto as well for their comments. Okay, the point of this exercise is to basically to have very lively, debates about where we think the political economic literature to go, be relevant to growth and social transformation. So there will be some agreement, there will be some disagreements. And I think this kind of conversation is something that should continue. But maybe I'm just going to 30 seconds to say two things. So first, we are not, me in particular, married to the term distortion. But, I think there is a good politics. There is you can call it first best, you can call it whatever, a la Meyerson, that we aim at, and it involves maybe competition, might involve transparency, might involve participation, might involve a lot of things. Okay, so the point here is to say, okay, can we imagine, this good politics, and can we get there, and how, So obviously this could be embedded in a broader social context where you have the economic factors, you have the economy, you have the politics, and you want to see how they match, and aim to that, and then study deviation. So I think we need to work in that direction, and I think the comment made had been very, very useful. The second point I wanted to make very briefly is also, I think the comment made by Rohini about the social and the sector, I think those are great, very useful comments. And let me put it this way. So what is interesting about democracy is that things sometimes that help entrepreneur can also help the labor sector. For instance, transparency. For instance, participation. The only way, for instance, you you caught elite capture is through some maybe grassroots movements by getting the people involved. So that in itself will help, for instance, raise those kind of issues of equity, about equity and inequality and poverty and so on. So I think it's interesting to include this very, very explicitly, and the issue of climate change as well. So yeah, I think I completely agree with many of the suggestions that were made, especially those two. And I think we are going to take them into consideration and make sure that this help very comprehensive and healthy debates about what we think should be the direction of the political economy literature as it relates to growth and social transformation. Thanks again.
Ernesto,
questions or comments, anybody?
Can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Joe Kabaski. I don't know if you, I just want to thank you guys all. Obviously, I'm somebody that's outside of this literature, only admiring it from afar. And I really liked all of the presentations. One thing I want to do is just say kind of what the role is of this paper in terms of others in STEG. This is a little bit of a response to Rohini, because we do think that the labor market is very important, and we do think that the environmental issues are very important. We have other pathfinding papers that are focusing on that, but they aren't focusing on the political economy aspects. And I do think that the political economy aspects are very important. And so one thing I think is thinking about, and I think this is what Rohini was getting at, and perhaps Daron too, he talked about education, that sort of thing. It's thinking about what is the impact. A lot of it is sort of like, what's the impact of political economy on growth and structural transformation in the macro, but not sort of what's the impact of growth and structural transformation on political economy. And I think that's pretty important. And I mean, another side besides just the elite capture is, populism on the other side and what that can lead to. And maybe that's something that Ernesto was referring to. And what would be the role in terms of public policy, investing in education, investing in roads, other things that are more inclusive to sort of preventing political fracture from rising inequality. I think these are all sort of important issues. And concretely, if we do come up, I mean, economists aren't great with coming up with policy advice, but at least policy lessons. It would be nice to know what the political consequences of certain policies might be. And maybe that's way beyond what the literature can really inform, but I think they're probably important considerations.
Thank you, Joe. Any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I think Doug wrote something.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, my sense is that much of the conversation here and perhaps much of the literature has focused on domestic political economy, the internal political economy within countries, rather than on international political economy, which we tend to think of as quite a separate sphere. And I don't want to add to Leonard and Monica's burdens here by suggesting that this is something they should tackle in the pathfinding paper. I think it's more a question, again, from somebody who doesn't operate much in this literature. But is the international political economy dimension one that we should be thinking about separately? Are there issues there? I'm thinking in part about the political economy of aid itself in relation to structural transformation and growth. And I'm just wondering if we're omitting something sufficiently central that we ought to be thinking about other ways to pull that in within the broader STEG umbrella. And so I'd just love to get comments or thoughts from anybody on that.
So maybe I should jump in very quickly and say yes. The answer is yes. So for instance, there is very much, at least in economics, less interest in studying these questions, apart from political economy of aid stuff. But political economy of state capture, lead capture by international actors, it's it's very, very big in political science, but less in economics. So I think this is one area, for instance, where we would like to see more more action, because obviously domestic firms do not have enough capital, enough expertise to be able to to be at the frontier, at least in the short term. So international capital play an important role. There is some paper showing, for instance, more like how CIA protects the interests of US companies in Latin America, by pressuring domestic governments. There are a lot of work on trade, like trade protection. But I think this is really an area where we should expand the scope of the inception paper, and we'll try to do that in next iteration.
I wasn't trying to push it back on you and Monica, but just to think whether this is something that I know it's an area that economists have stayed farther away from, but I'm just thinking I have colleagues, departmental colleagues, for instance, who work in African politics or African history, who would be a little bit surprised at the idea that we should understand what's going on in the politics of countries as entirely the product of domestic political, I guess we would include longer term history, but people who want to think about contemporary international political economy issues.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I could just jump in on that, I think it isn't the case that the political economy literature has ignored international factors. What it has assumed is that international factors work by affecting domestic politics. So, there's a lot of work on the effects of colonial history, the effects of conflict across countries, World Bank and IMF interventions, especially among political scientists, but some among economists. But in all of these cases, and of course, trade, relative prices that come from abroad, but in all of these cases, the effect is through domestic politics. Now, one could take a different perspective and say, domestic politics can be sidelined and you just want to look at the international factors. And you can also enrich that, which is what, the international relations literature does. Look at the game theoretic, strategic, or other interactions across countries. I think those are all interesting, but I think as a first, second, or even third step, domestic politics being the relevant one for many firms, rural populations, agriculture, most of the educational, etc. policies, I think is not a bad starting point, but obviously it needs to go beyond that.
So I see a hand up by Tristan Reed. Tristan, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I just, on Doug's comment, I wanted to make 2 points. One was I just want to flag a paper I have with Penny Goldberg, where we look at the effect of international integration agreements, and that's not just trade agreements, but mobility of labor and capital, and how that is linked to poverty reduction over time. So it's an attempt to do that. What we don't do is talk about where these agreements come from and the political process that generates them. But a second observation I want to make is that something I've been thinking about a lot, but I'm not sure exactly how to study, is that I think on this topic of structural transformation, at least in some papers, we often conclude that some form of industrial policy would be beneficial for countries, either to say subsidizing exports or some type of state aid. But those type of policies are actually illegal under most international trade agreements. And so, when you think about designing some sort of industrial policy to promote structural transformation, you're actually quite constrained by the international community. And some people have argued that those constraints are actually, the result of capture of that process by firms in rich countries. So, I just think that's perhaps an interesting angle on political economy of international agreements and organizations that could use more work. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan.
While waiting for other comments, can I make
Absolutely.
2 comments?
Please go ahead.
So I want to make one comment on this political distortions, what's the benchmark, and then I want to make one comment on Rohini's excellent suggestions. So let me start with the latter. Thanks, Rohini, for highlighting dual economy and Arthur Lewis. I think those are really super important issues. But I would add one thing to that. I think the early literature thought of dual economy as something natural. There's a modern sector, there's a backward sector. Actually, when you look at the details, this is a point that Jim Robinson and I try to make in our book, Why Nations Fail. A lot of dual economy is actually created by political factors. Some parts of the economy, especially during colonial times, the non-European part of the economy was not given right, was not given room, was starved of capital. So there is a lot of political background to understanding dual economy, and I don't think you can separate it from it even today. And then on the sort of political distortions, what's the benchmark? Leonard and Ernesto made those points. I think those are completely right. But the question is what you do with the benchmark. So I think the way that economists think about it and the political distortions, I was going to give this example, but then I was afraid of running out of time, really sort of encourages a way of thinking that was really my target. So take one specific example. You look at an economy, you see a lot of unions that are, as do what unions do, and you say, oh, well, that's a distortion. They're creating rents for their employees. They may even do lots of other bad things. And the political distortions reasoning would say, well, let's get rid of unions. And that's exactly the argument that was used over the last 30 years for reducing union power. But actually, I think there's a good case to be made that
is so important.
Sorry?
No?
Yeah, so there's a political economy. And
that's why the theorem of the second best is so important.
Exactly. So there's a second best theory, but it's sort of becomes secondary if you put too much emphasis on the sort of the first best benchmark.
Yeah, that's right. But then, do we have an alternative to thinking about first best and second best and keeping the theorem of the second best in mind? So in a way, we haven't decided to do that when we think about markets, for example. Are there additional reasons why?
Well, I think it's a mistake when in the context of markets as well.
I see.
I think it has led to a lot of naive competitive analysis in the context of markets. But I think it's more severe in the context of political economy.
I just jump in on 2 things here. So Daron, I completely agree on the historical basis. And I think if you see some of which was around the same time, the kind of Latin American writing on dual economy, sort of Celso Ferdado and others, I think they were very explicit about the institutional basis for why you had this traditional sector emerge. And I don't think Schumpeter per se was against sectors, he was just agnostic about it. I think it just like never emerged in that literature until I think there was this sort of more left-wing movement. In terms of the benchmark, I don't know, sometimes I sort of feel like this is an animal that economists have created for themselves in the sort of first best and second best. And I think what I was trying to push us towards is, to really think about how seriously do we want to take democracy. If we find that a lot of what we think are the first best policies for structural transformation, even in the short run, are just going to increase, for instance, inequality, are going to be opposed by labor unions. How strongly do we as economists want to take a normative stance on what should be the right policy? Or is our job more just, at least to start with, is just the positive analysis of trying to understand what we might think of as political distortions? Where are they getting their base? Is the base only elite capture, or is sometimes the base actually, I don't know, populism and popular capture? I think certainly saying what's happening even in advanced democracies right now, I think makes us realize that certainly one of the best ways of weakening democracy is populism. And populism has some base in inequality.
So may I jump in here, not just as an economist, but also as a political scientist and a political activist? You know, I mean, when people are willing to die for democracy, are willing to die to have a voice, it's probably because there is something they are aspiring to that they consider, we may call it first best or whatever, you know. So, and but at a point, I mean, like, you know, I mean, the reason why you can persuade people to make that choice, you know, that might lead to a revolution, that might lead to a lot of things, is because they think that the status quo is bad, is inefficient. Or I mean, maybe I'm not hold on to the term efficiency here, you know, but the status quo, which means people, you know, massive corruption, you know, oppressive policies, racial discrimination, it's bad. You know, there is something that they're aspiring to. So I think if we have a very flexible approach to what we mean by first best, which is not just, as Rohini have suggested, purely based on entrepreneurship, purely based on, you know, like the interest of entrepreneur, but something inclusive, which leads to, you know, a more, you know, a more balanced distribution of resources and power in society. You know, the first best, in fact, might actually include, you know, labor rights, might actually include, you know, all these things that we are talking about, you know. So I'm not attached to a very narrow, very economistic and view of what first best is. The general point here is that there is a sense in which the vast majority, a large number of groups in society is aiming to something, you know, and that's something that we can model, that we can formalize, can be our benchmark. And then we can see to what extent we move away from that and what can be done to get close to it, you know. So I think, you know, I'm not like a general equilibrium, you know, basically neoclassical economist here. I just wanted to say there is something out there that would be good, you know, and we can formalize it, and then we can see to what extent, you know, what we are doing, get away from it or close to it, and so that we can actually think creatively about reform, because the reform is to be able to achieve something. So what are we going to achieve? We don't know, we don't have some kind of benchmark, you know. So I think that's my view. You know, I think the semantic of the term and stuff, we can talk about it, but that's the idea, you know. So, but anyway.
So going to Rohini's point about the pro-poor focus, which I think is very relevant. Is there any evidence that pro-entrepreneurship policies tend to be also pro-poor policies? I think that it seems like an interesting intersection for the focus of this Inception paper.
I don't know what Monica, do you want to say something? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know of any type of such evidence. I completely agree with Rohini that, in a sense, aiming for growth or structural transformation might not be the objective, and we should bring in what do people want. On the other hand, I worry whether that should be our guiding benchmark, because people preferences are also malleable by influences and so on. So the way I see this literature is that we might want to aim to some more fundamental first best along the lines that have been discussed here, like equal representation and these kind of things. No? And if I can bring back some of the things that have been discussed to the topic of elite capture, you could also think of the concept of elite capture through the lens of democracy, in the sense that we're calling situations of elite capture when individuals have more de facto power than what it would naturally accrue to them by their numbers. No, so that it itself has the notion that, you know, some people, each individual should have some level of influence into politics by the votes, no, by the number of them. If you have a disproportionate amount of power of decision making, there's something wrong to that. So in a sense, that's one conceptualization or one mapping to this particular exercise. But of course, I learned all these things through many of you in particular, Daron, so I'm happy to hear whether you think that this is a helpful benchmark or not.
To follow up on what Monica has said, I think this is a fantastic idea that one of the things, I mean, I think I will not step away from the need to think about inclusive growth, that pro-poor growth. And the only channel through which this can happen here is by bundling what basically unleash technological innovation that includes some kind of institutional innovation that get growth, product of growth to be shared more equally. You see what I mean? Like, for instance, if you take the idea of participation and transparency as the only way you can break political connection, you know, like, for instance, expose this kind of corrupt deal that firms are making with government and blah, blah, blah. But this cannot be done by just some technocrat. It has to be done by the people being involved. But then in the same process, then you have people like Bernie Sanders coming up and say, well, you know what about us? You know, can we, where do we get out of this deal? You know, you see what I mean? So it could be like the only way the innovation growth happen is through some level of participation. And this participation will not be totally free from some pressure for redistribution. You see what I mean? So, and I think at least it's a question we need to address. You know, we need to get people to think about this. And find some empirical evidence along the line that Ernesto and Rohini have suggested, that in fact, we cannot be just focused entirely on entrepreneurs and so on. We also have to look at the social aspect to think how we can go together.
So we are about just run out of time. I would like, unless people have some burning thoughts, I think it's a good time to call it a day for today. I think a great first day. I would like to thank the presenters and the panelists, especially for their very thoughtful and deep remarks. And I think we'll reconvene for tomorrow.